I'm Becky Benfield. I'm the lead program manager for high availability and disaster recovery and exchange. We have a whole team that's been working very hard for the last couple of years on trying to improve our high availability story. And I think a lot of people here are probably already quite aware of clustered continuous replication and local continuous replication. In SP1, we've added some new features around that just to extend the functionality in some of the data protection and service protection for Exchange. So the objectives here is that I want you to come away and understand what are the built-in features, what are the things that you're not going to necessarily have to go to a third party in order to get the protection that you need. And I also want you to come away with having a good understanding of what are the best practices around the deployment and the configuration, and what are the options that you have, because there are quite a few new options available. The key takeaways are that in SP1, we've really, with this new feature that some of you hopefully have heard about called standby continuous replication, some of the issues around that we were facing with clustered continuous replication have really been dealt with. You'll see as we get into some detail about this around some of the advancements in the networking for your redundancy. So the agenda today is I'm going to look at the big one, which is the standby continuous replication, and then also replication over redundant networks. And this is, if you have multiple networks, then you can utilize other networks in your deployment for the replication and leave the network that's available for client activity just for that activity. We're also going to talk about the Windows 2008 support in SP1, some improvements to transport dumpster, improvements to the manageability, particularly in what we've added to the GUI, and some of the performance improvements. So in RTM, we delivered CCR, LCR, and the more traditional version of SCC. How many people here have had some acquaintance with CCR, Clustered Continuous Replication? Okay, so there are quite a few people who haven't really had a lot of exposure to it. So I'm gonna have a chance to show a little bit of what that is. In SP1, we really are expanding CCR to allow for essentially a third copy, and that's what SCR is. CCR allows you to have 2 copies of your data, which are clustered, and on 2 different servers, and SCR allows you to add a third copy. We really were focusing on the site resiliency case for this third copy. We've heard a lot from our customers that they wanted to be able to have a third copy of their data in a different data center and still have the local redundancy and the local high availability in their primary data center. The nice thing with SP1 with standby continuous replication is it doesn't require clustering for that. Now the downside, or well, you might say that it's a good feature as well. Some people have different requirements around it. Is that it is a manual activation. There is no requirement around the networks, stretching the networks with SCR, and it can span across multiple AD sites. The one thing is that it is a manual activation, and so it's really more of having that data redundancy outside of your primary data center for the case where you've really got a more serious failure. In it, we've also added the ability to do failovers at a more granular level, and this is at the storage group level, which for those who don't know, continuous replication requires a one-to-one mapping of database to storage group. So essentially, the granular level here is also the database. There's also a lot of configuration flexibility, and I'm going to go into that in more detail in the next couple of slides. And as I mentioned, there's the manual activation. So, standby continuous replication. What you see here is the CCR, which is the clustered continuous replication. You have two servers. They each have their own storage, and there is a replication going between between the two servers. It's log shipping. We are shipping the logs. As a log closes, it gets shipped over to the other side, and that log is then played into the database. With standby continuous replication, we've added a third node here, or a third copy, and a third server. It's not a node in the cluster, it's a standalone. And now we're replicating to both places. We're replicating the logs to both locally within the CCR cluster and to the standby continuous replication server or target. So here, when we mentioned that, I mentioned a minute ago that there's a lot of flexibility in your configuration, this will show you here how flexible it really is. So if you see over on the left side, you've got CCR, you've got a standalone server, and you've got SCC, which is single copy cluster, or more like the traditional 2003. Say that again? Yes. Well, you'll see in a second how this works, okay? So the question was about, well, you'll see right here. So the target can be to a standalone, or it can be to a passive node. Now this passive node has been installed with the cluster bits, but it's really not an exchange-aware node at this point. The target can also be it can be from a standalone to another standalone or to a passive node. And you can also have the source be the single copy cluster going to the mailbox on the standalone or the passive node. And when it's a standalone to a standalone, you can actually go back the other direction. So you can have some portion of your storage groups that are on the source also be targets. So the storage groups on what we might think of as the source machine actually becomes a target as well. The passive node only gets activated when you go and do a number of steps, which I'll be showing you in a moment, to go and turn this into an actual exchange cluster. So, as I mentioned, the configuration is at the storage group level. This is the command here that tells you how to do that configuration to allow for standby continuous replication. You do enable storage group copy, and what you provide is the standby machine. So recovery red 01 here is an actual machine name. The replay lag time, SCR defaults to an actual lag time of a day, and you can go and add in some other number of hours. This is configurable. The idea here is that it protects you against some kinds of corruption, logical corruption, that could get replicated. If we lag behind the replay of those logs into the copy of the database, then you have an opportunity to catch that corruption before those logs are played into it. And then you can just play forward up to the point of the corruption. So as I mentioned, it is one-to-one database to storage group. The file paths have to be the same on both sides, okay? And the target machine has a maximum of 50 storage groups. Now that can be 50 storage groups from a variety of different sources. So you can have a multiple to one, a many to one configuration for your SCR target. The activation, which I mentioned was manual, is either with recover server if your target is a standalone, or recover CMS. This is with the setup command, setup recover server or setup recover CMS. And this is what, and the recover CMS is what you will use if your target is a passive node. You can also recover an individual database. And if you recover the individual database on that SCR copy, then you will use database portability. And I will show you explicitly the commands for doing that. So we mentioned the log replay time. It has to be a minimum of 50 log files or a time that you specify. Okay, and it's going to be the minimum of either of those. So if you had set your lag time to 3 days, but you had more logs than that, and you said it was going to be 50 logs in 3 days, not a typical case, but you would go with, it would take the minimum. We do not support backups from the SCR target. So I know that that's come up for a number of people. They've wondered why we weren't doing that. We believe in a sense that the SCR target really is a backup, is kind of like a backup. It is available for many of the reasons that people do backups. Now, you may want to do backups for additional reasons, and you still have the ability to do your backups off of the CCR active and the CCR passive. That is the continuous cluster replication, continuous replication, active and passive. However, at the same time, the SCR target is aware of the fact that a backup has occurred and is aware that it needs to do log truncation after a backup. So let's take a look at how this database portability would work if you had one particular database that was corrupted or failed, say a disk failure. So you have your CCR cluster, node 1 and node 2. And now you have MBXA, which is your standby continuous replication target. On that target, you're going to run enable SCR, and there's a commandlet, a PowerShell commandlet for doing that. And now you're going to have replication going to that node, that MBXA. It will continue to also go to node 2 at the same time. Now, if node 1 failed, you would have a failover to node 2. And the replication now would go from node 2 to MBXA. Now, if you lost the entire cluster, say, for example, this is in 2 different data centers, and you had some kind of power outage or you had some kind of larger failure, now node 1 and node 2 are both unavailable. Now, you will go and run disable SCR on that standalone, on the MBXA. And you'll go ahead and mount the databases on MBXA. And now you're going to rehome the mailboxes. And what that means is you're going to run move mailbox, you're going to run, actually move storage group path, and you're going to run move database path. And then you're also going to run move mailbox. And you're going to do that with configuration only. How many people here have heard of the move mailbox with configuration only? Okay, so a good number. What this is doing is it's really just updating what's in the AD. So you know that the data is already over there. You don't need to move the data. All you need to do is update the AD so that now any clients that are trying to connect and find the database in the backend server know where to find it. Now the client will be able to connect. So I have a demo. Now what I've got here, you can see I've got the Peach 3. Can you see that very well? Okay, good, yeah, it looks pretty good. Peach here is a CMS, a clustered mailbox server, and in that we have 3 different storage groups. Okay. Now, if you look over here, you'll see that we have on this particular machine, in the active machine, we have a large number of log files. Okay. And if we go down and we look at, this is node 2 site 1, here this shows all of the log files that have been replicating over to the passive machine in the cluster. If you look here at 304 all site 1, that's a standalone target for SCR. It has nothing in it. If I do get storage group Peach SG3, you'll see that you have it's clustered, and I'm going to show you what it says about standbys. Oops. It shows an empty bracket. There's nothing there. Now, if I go and I run enable storage group copy, Peach SG3. Now, the key here is to type in standby machine, okay? And I'm going to type in the standalone target. Okay. Now, if I show you right now, get storage group copy status for Peach SG3, standby machine 304, all site 1, you'll see that it shows not configured. This is because it's polling every once in a while to update what the configuration is. So in order to, for the purpose of time, I'm just going to stop the service. And this will force the update in the configuration to happen more quickly. Maybe. This is going down to some machines down in downstairs, which I brought all the way with me from Seattle. Big bulky machines. Okay, start MS Exchange REPL. Now, if I go do, now you can see it's helping. All right. Now, if we look over here, okay, we have this, and this. Now we have log files in 304 all site 1. We've now gone and replicated all of those log files to the other side, to this standalone target. So now I'm going to show you how to activate this, okay? We've got everything over there, and say we've lost this database. So I'm going to do something, I'm just going to dismount it. This would be simulating a failure. So I've dismounted this database, okay? And I'm going to run restore storage group copy for Peach SG3 for the standby machine 304 all site 1 and force. Now what this is going to do is it's going to attempt to pull over any last logs that had been generated but had not yet been copied over when I went and dismounted the database. Okay, what it's saying here is there's a possibility, one second, there's a possibility that you could have lost data because E00, which is the log file that's being written to, hasn't closed yet. So there's a potential to lose a little bit of data there. There was a question. Can you go over to the microphone? It'll get taped that way as well. It's not possible to see? It's too small? Okay. So I will change the properties here. I apologize. Font. Okay, let's see, what would be a good one? Anybody got any ideas? Let's see, let's try that. Is that visible or not really either? That's kind of light. Can you see that? How's that? Is that better? Okay. So you can see here what I wrote was right here, the storage group copy, and that, as I said, was going to pull over the last few logs. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to, if we do get storage group storage group, and we do let's do 3. Now you can see that there aren't, when we did this restore, there's no more standby machine, okay, because now we're basically taking over. You can see that I need to go and on the, let's see. What I need to do here is I need to click to overwrite, okay, on the restore. I want to overwrite the EDB file, okay? And now I'm going to run, I'm going to go and move the storage group path, and I'm going to move the database path, okay? So what this will do is it's going to go and make the changes up in the AD, as I mentioned before. This is going to do the configuration only changes. Okay. Now, going to mount the database. Okay, oops. Let me make sure that is it going to let me mount? But it was dismounted. Let me make sure that I have, let's say SG3. Okay, hold on a second. Okay. I don't understand why I got this temp in here because I did not type that. Any ideas, Scott? Okay, I'm going to try that again. The storage group path, I see. Yep, I see it. Okay, apologize. Did I copy that? Okay. Let's see if we got this updated. All right. I'm not sure exactly what happened there, but what you would have is this would become the something, I typed something wrong here. I was testing it and I lost some stuff, so I had to go and do it again at the last minute. So what you would have here is it would go and it would get rehomed in the AD, and now any of your clients would be able to access their databases in here. And what you would have is, you can see here, this would actually say the name of the path for that database. I wonder if there was one. I don't see it. Okay, I'm going to move on. I have to. Okay. So, what did we go through here? We needed to go and enable the storage group copy for standby continuous replication. Now, typically, the enable will go and it will create the database file over there on the target. Now, if you, for some reason, discover that it hasn't done that, then you would run update storage group copy, and that will pull over the database file itself. Now, we also have test replication health, which is going to test a number of things. It's going to test both that the cluster service is running. It will also go and test that the replication itself is healthy and that it's keeping pace with the generation of the logs on the active. When you do the switchover, you will do the restore storage group copy, as I said, to force any last logs over. And then you will run, if you're doing this for a passive node where this is a cluster, you're going to run recover CMS instead of doing the database portability that I just showed you. When you need to go back the other direction, what you're going to do is you're going to have to clear out what was on the original source. So you've had a failure in your main data center. You've now activated your SCR target. Say your SCR target is a passive node, okay? You've created that into a full cluster. Now your primary data center comes back up and is now available. You need to go back the other direction. And you essentially turn the primary into an SCR target. Get that back up to being current with the most current information. You clear it of any cluster information that it was in there originally. So you run setup clear local CMS, and then you start over again from 1A. Okay, later this afternoon I'm going to be doing another session which is going to talk more in depth about the site resiliency and the use of SCR where you're doing the setup recover CMS. Okay, some of the things you should keep in mind when you go to use this solution. Some of these are pretty basic. Most people wouldn't know it, but they're easy to trip up on. They're easy to forget and get yourself into some trouble. So you want to obviously make sure that you log on with the credentials that have the right access to the AD, to Exchange. You're going to have IP addresses, static IP addresses for when you do the failover. You need to have those already assigned and ready to use. Make sure that somebody else is not using them. We also, when we did this test, we had discovered that when there was an upgrade on some of the Exchange servers, they hadn't always been rebooted afterwards. So you want to make sure that in the case where you're going to have to use your SDR target, that you go ahead and do your reboots so that you're all set and ready to go. You don't run into that at that point. You're also going to want to make sure that the pathways in your AD sites, that the AD can replicate even if your data center has gone down, has failed. So if you have a primary AD site where information is going to get updated, you want to make sure that it can make it over and get replicated to your backup data center or your standby data center, that it's not a path that goes through the failed data center. Now, this is not as a big deal in Windows 2008 because Windows 2008 doesn't have the idea of a PDC or a primary domain controller. You also want to make sure you know how fast your logs, how fast your hardware is, where it can replay the logs, so that you have an idea of how long it's going to take to get up and running, to do your recovery. There will be some delay from a DNS update because the DNS replication itself. And for all of these solutions, we tell people you really, really need to make sure that you go and test it out on a regular basis. So what are some of the replication performance improvements? I almost fell off there. The replication performance improvements, you can see they're pretty dramatic here, especially when you have low latencies. So the x-axis on this chart is your network latency round trip, and your y-axis shows how many logs that you're going to be able to replicate. So you can see the huge improvements that we made in SP1 when you have low latencies. If it's less than 1 millisecond, even with 10 milliseconds, there's a huge improvement, but the biggest improvements are over the fast links. This also shows what happens. It's pretty dramatic. You can see what happens when your latency goes up, the logs transferred goes down pretty quickly, and then it kind of flattens out. What we did was a number of tests around the TCP window size. So what we learned was that if you increase the TCP window size, that you can get pretty dramatic improvements, particularly where there are low latencies. So around the 10 millisecond latency, you have gone from about 5-6 logs per minute, up to about 27. So that's pretty dramatic. So this kind of wraps up and summarizes a little bit what we saw in MSIT. The peak, when there was a peak load from clients and peak traffic, it was 6 logs per minute per storage group. So if you have 50 storage groups, then it's going to be about 300. We did test it over time, and it did decrease. When there was no IPsec involved for security purposes, then the performance was better. So what this really says is you do want to go and tune that TCP window size. All right, the next area that I want to talk about is replication over redundant networks. So we added the ability, you have to have 2 networks in CCR, right? And when you have clustering, you have to have your public and you have to have your mixed network. And what we have done is take advantage of the fact that there are those 2 networks and allowed you to do your seeding and your replication. The seeding is when you seed the database or you make a copy of the database on your target. And we now made it possible to do all of that without conflicting with the traffic that's happening from the clients. So what you have here is you would run enable continuous replication host name, which is a new command, and you would run get clustered mailbox server status to see which ones are now operational. The output of that will show you which ones are actually been configured and which ones are failed and which ones are being used. If the private network, or mixed network to be exact, if that fails for any reason, and you can have more than one, you can have multiple of those networks, and we will attempt to do our replication over any of those networks. However, if you then run out of those mixed networks, we will then resort to the public network to make sure that you continue to have your replication going on. In order to get the seeding to occur over that private network or mixed network, you would run the update storage group copy, and you would divide these hosts. Okay, just be clear, I did mention this a second ago that it was mixed network, not really the private network, and those are two different things in the cluster world. The strict name checking, that's about what is in the DNS. And the static DNS entry is got to be static for this, for these host names. Okay. So. Right now, I have this performance counter. And the performance counter has two networks on it. There's a network that's the public network, and there's a network that's the private network, okay? So if I go and I do some activity, so say, for example, I suspend storage group copy, and then I resume, you will have, let's see, I need to, where did my clue admin go? There it is. Okay. You can see here that I have this private network that's been created. Now, I don't have it, it's actually online, so it's doing, it's actually doing work over the private network. Now, if I go and mount this database, okay, you can see that I had some traffic over the blue one. If I show you what is actually in here, get clustered mailbox server status, mailbox status. You can see that I have this private node, I have this network here. So can you guys see that back there? Are you able to see? Okay, I'm hoping you can. So these are the different networks that are available for the replication. Okay, none of them are failed. Now, if I go and disable Um, okay, hold on a second. The host name, yeah. Sorry. Well, that is the host name, actually. The host name, so the host name is the, in Clue admin, the host name is this. Okay, I have a demo of this. That I can play. That's my son, by the way. So you can see that here we're going and looking at the fact that we've got these three databases here. And that's to show you that we're online with Peach on node 1, site 1. You can see that we have the private networks here. In Clue admin, they show the private networks and the public network. Now, this in the performance counter here, it will show you that we do, in fact, do our log shipping over the private network or over the public network. You can see that what happened here was we started using the other network. And the red graph here is showing from the perfmon counter that the log shipping is actually occurring over the other network. Now, if we go and we put the private network online, we will start going over the other network. So you can see the command here is enable continuous replication host name, and you give the name, you can see down here, you give the name that is what you've created for these networks, the two networks. They're the NICs, and what it contains in that is simply an IP address and a net name. And each node needs to have that at each endpoint of your private network. Now, if you bring it online, you'll see that it's going to start using the other network. You can tell from the perfmon counter. It's online pending, so it's not quite there yet, but it's about to start taking over the log shipping. So now it's come online, and now you can see that we're now log shipping over the private network or the mixed network. Okay? So I'd like to move on to what we have for Windows 2008 support. You can see what we've got in this table is 3 columns, one that shows us what we had in 2003, what we support in Windows 2008, and then what does Exchange actually support out of the features that Windows provides. So in the top columns, we're talking about the top rows, we're talking about the different types of quorum that are available. Now, there are those different types of quorums, but we have recommendations. And the recommendations are that you would use what we have is the file share witness, which is a version of the MNS or majority node set, also known now in Windows Server 2008 as node majority quorum. For SCC, you would continue to use a disk witness. We also will only be supporting 8 nodes in Exchange, although 2008 provides clustering up to 16 nodes. We don't really see much reason for the larger clusters. Windows 2008 is providing the different versions of IP, IPv4 and IPv6, and we will support both of those versions. We also are now supporting DHCP version 4. And the last one has been something that a lot of people have asked us about, the multi-subnet support. When you have a CCR cluster, that's an active and a passive node cluster, and you stretch those across, then you have across a data center, two different data centers. Now, currently in RTM, you have to have those both on the same subnet. With Windows 2008, you can have those on 2 separate subnets. So this is to show you how that gets configured. In what's now called the failover cluster management GUI, which in 2003 was the cluster administrator, now you can see we have the two IP addresses. One is online and one is offline. The one that's online is the one that's associated with the active node in the 2-node cluster. This is what they've changed in the properties to allow this to occur. They've essentially created, you have an IP address, and they've added the OR. So it can be one or the other. The possible owners are going to show the 2 nodes here, and which one is checked as the one that's currently owning that IP address. Oops. Now, if we go online with the second, if we have a failover to the passive node, now we're going to have that second IP address come online. And if you do an NS lookup, you can see what it had been before was, excuse me, was in the subnet 1 with IP address 22, and now we're in subnet 3 after the failover. Okay. I mentioned earlier that for this replication, now that you can use the redundant networks, there's not going to be quite the contention or quite the conflict between the traffic from the clients as well as the traffic from the log shipping. However, you may still want to go and get that better performance, even though it's on the private network. And this is what you would set. You would set your I'm sorry, I was thinking about something else. This is about when you go and you are going to change that subnet, and you're going to start using the second subnet when you do a failover to your passive node. The TTL, which is the time to live in DNS, is typically 20 minutes, which means that clients will not actually be able to access their mailboxes until there's been the DNS update. So you can actually go and configure in Windows for the TTL to be reduced. And what we recommend is the 300 is in seconds, so that would be a 5-minute TTL. Now note that the time to live is accumulative, so that if at different points at which there needs to be this lookup, if it's already taken some number of the time, like 2 minutes, the next step is not gonna start over at 5. It's a total of 5 minutes across from end to end. So we recommend that you use the lower TTL for when you're using the multi-subnet clustering with Windows 2008. And we also recommend that when you're using SCR and you have a target that's in a different data center with a different IP subnet, that you also use the lower time to live. Okay. Changes in transport dumpster. Now, it sounds like there may be some people who are not familiar with transport dumpster. How many people here have never heard of transport dumpster? Okay, there's quite a few. So I'm going to give just a minute of background. In cluster continuous replication, where you have 2 nodes that are clustered, they have 2 copies of their data. Each node has a copy of the data, and they're replicating. This is asynchronous replication. As I mentioned, a log closes, and then it gets replicated to the other side. Because it's asynchronous, there is the chance that you will not get the last log that's still open at the time of a failover. So there's a failure, you fail over, there was still a log that was open, it was still in use, it didn't get copied over yet. So what happens? Transport dumpster is essentially, it's a dumpster that's living on the hub server, and it's a queue that's keeping a hold of any messages that have already been delivered to the back end, to the mailboxes, or to the databases. Now, when there's a failover, the new active goes and requests that the hub transport redeliver any messages that had been in its queue, and it's a very wide window. It's quite a few hours. So the likelihood is you are going to get any mail back that might have been represented in that log that was still open at the time of the failover. So there will be a redelivery of that mail, and any duplicates get filtered out by store already, so you won't get any duplicate mail. Now, any data that does not go through transport it's not covered by this. So, for example, if you have contacts, if you have an appointment in your own calendar, those kinds of things are not going to end up going through transport dumpster. So if they happen to be represented in the log at the time of the failover, you won't get that data back. There is the potential to lose that data. Now, what did we do in SP1? We added dumpster statistics. So you can now see what is actually in the dumpster and not just know that it covers a window of time. So if you go and run the get storage group copy status with the dumpster statistics flag on there, you can see that the date on which the currency of the dumpster, how many items are in it. So the 2 there represents the number of items that are sitting in the dumpster and how much space they represent at the bottom. We also provided transport dumpster for LCR. So LCR is the, how many people here know about LCR, or local continuous replication? Okay, quite a few people. Okay, so local continuous replication, for those who don't know, you have a single server and you have 2 copies of your data, and the data is getting replicated between 2 physical storage, but you have 1 server that is managing both sides, or both copies. We did not have at RTM, we did not have transport dumpster for LCR. We have now added that. So in the case where you need to fail over, you will get any kind of delivery, again, to your second copy. We put a big investment in RTM around the manageability. We put a lot into the PowerShell tasks. We created a lot of ability and capability to get information about the status, about what is happening with the replication for the configuration. What we've added in SP1 was the ability to have an easier way to do your monitoring. And we've also added a number of things to the GUI. So here under the test replication health, you can see that we now, under this one PowerShell commandlet, are going to be testing against the availability or the health of both the node availability, the quorum, and the cluster service. So the quorum being, for example, the file share witness. We're also testing the replication service status. So that is, are the logs copying over and keeping up? Are they getting replayed at a decent rate into the copy of the database? And we're also monitoring the storage group copy status. So have we gone into failed? Has the copy, the replication become suspended? Are the queue lengths getting too long? Is it not keeping up? Is the replication not keeping up? And all of this has been added into the MOM, the management pack, and you can set alert. Well, we're setting alerts on it. So when these things happen, there will be alerts that come up in MOM, the operations manager. The new GUI that I mentioned, we have a lot of the operations for CCR, for clustered continuous replication. We have those now in the GUI. You can see the move, stop, start, CMS, the CCR status, replication status, and some of the more common operations that you would perhaps use. We've added those to the GUI. There was enough interest in having those in the GUI, even though we had thought originally that they were less frequent or less common commands. And we've added some more information as well in what's going to get with some other columns for the storage groups of what gets displayed. The performance improvements, those are some other improvements we made in SP1. I mentioned a number of them, or I mentioned particularly the replication performance. Specifically, if you go and tune the TCP window, it used to be that the I/O in RTM was on the active for every 1 I/O. The passive, or the copy, was 3 I/Os. With some performance improvements in SP1, they're now 1-to-1. There's no increased I/O for the copy. We also increased how quickly a move or a failover would occur between the active and the passive nodes. So we now, for example, if there's a failure, well, the active node has failed. There's no point in flushing the database cache on that node. So, of course, we just skip it, and we go over to the active node. For SCC, we also do some preparatory flushing that would allow us to get that move much more quickly as well. So that covers most of the improvements that we have added in in SP1 for high availability and some of around disaster recovery. I'm going to go into more detail around the disaster recovery in the session that's at 3:45 this afternoon. It's back in this room. And there I'm going to be talking more about what are the different classifications of failures and what are some different strategies for dealing with those, including some of the high availability strategies, but not just the high availability strategies. What are some of the more strategies around backup and some of our other features? Some other breakout sessions that you might be interested in, you can see listed here. We also have some webcasts that might be interesting to you to take a look at. And then tomorrow I have a session that's going to be an interactive session in the afternoon. So I hope that some of you will come and attend that. So this is our chance for a few minutes of Q&A. And if you could go up to the microphones on the side for your questions so they can get recorded. Yes, please.
I have a question regarding the dumpster.
Regarding what?
The dumpster function.
Oh,
Now, I came across some documentation from Microsoft where it stated that the dumpster can be edited, of course, in order to, especially in the circumstances where it has to do with CCR. And there it was recommended, if I recall correctly, 1.5 times the size of whatever is expected to be the. But is there any mechanism? Does Microsoft have any strategy to how to come up with those numbers regarding?
For how big how big it should be?
What recommend? Yeah, exactly. How can one come to the average of the recommended dumpster size?
Well, the dumpster size is actually set to a certain size. It's something like
18, isn't it?
Yeah, 18 megabytes, right? Yeah. What I think you want to do is to think about the actual, what is the rate at which your transport, your hub is actually delivering messages, okay? And if you think that a failover occurs in maybe about 5 minutes, and you want to make sure that that window is large enough so that you are going to catch any data that was trying to get submitted at the time, you would just want to base it on what is the delivery rate, or what's the typical the average delivery rate, or maybe you want to base it on the peak. And the peak load. How fast is data getting pushed through the dumpster and getting pushed out the backside? I don't know, Scott, do you have any other thoughts about that? Yeah. I think there's a mic. Is this working? Yeah, I think so. Or that one might be working there too.
So that 18 megabytes is actually just the default. You can configure it, as Becky was saying. The value that we have, 1.5 times the average message size, or the largest message size in your organization, or if you don't have any size limits in your org, 1.5 times the average size of messages sent. That's really, as Becky said, just to capture that window of opportunity that might happen during the outage. The other thing to consider with respect to the transport dumpster, it's really just a special area inside the mail.q file on the hub transport server, but it's actually distributed across all the hub transport servers in the site containing the clustered mailbox server in the case of CCR, or now in SP1 when you have any storage groups enabled for LCR. because of the built-in resilience and load balancing of hub transport servers, messages for any particular storage group that's enabled for continuous replication could actually be distributed across multiple hub servers in the site. So you want to keep that in mind when you're doing the sizing, because you only get one size to choose, and it's a global size that's going to affect every transport queue for every system in that site. So you want to factor that in as well.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, there's over here.
On 2003 Windows Cluster Administrator, it isn't recommended to move group. It's actually recommended to do that from PowerShell.
Uh-huh.
So in upcoming Windows 2008 console, is it aware of the resources so that bad things don't happen? We do that from the GUI.
Well, let me just clarify what the reason for that recommendation is.
It may end up like databases won't mount because
Right.
it's a huge. It can be a huge thing. I don't know, databases
Right.
or other resources.
So the reason, yeah, so the cluster, we want to have you use that so it won't go and try and mount if it's outside of what you've configured to be allowable loss, data loss. So if you...
Actually, I was talking about the Windows cluster administrator is unaware of some resources.
Exactly. So well, the cluster administrator is it unaware of any resources? I don't think
Some resources.
Okay.
So
Go ahead on about your blog.
You're probably talking about the blog that you saw on the team blog about the differences between.
Exactly.
Sure. So I wrote that, so I'm happy to answer that for you. So we have two types of clusters. We've got a single copy cluster, the shared storage cluster, and we now have this new cluster continuous replication. So it's fully cluster aware. Exchange setup is cluster aware. Exchange is cluster aware. One of the challenges, though, is that the cluster is not Exchange aware. Now, what happens when you move a clustered mailbox server between nodes? In the case of a single copy cluster, you're picking up its identity and its storage, and you're changing ownership to a new node. That's fine. There's nothing special or unique that's going on there. Everything about that clustered mailbox server is moving over. But what happens when you move a clustered mailbox server in a CCR environment? It's a very different environment. For one thing, there's no shared storage, which means when you pick up the identity of that clustered mailbox server and you move it over to the passive node, it is now using a completely different set of storage, a completely different database copy, completely different storage groups, and the copies that have been maintained by the continuous replication feature. Now, when you move a clustered mailbox server in a CCR environment, it's very important that that copy be healthy and up to date. After all, it's no good if it's too far behind in replication and can't be mounted. So to make sure it's healthy and up to date, we actually put some logic inside of our exchange management tasks, both in our move clustered mailbox server task and in the new GUI that we have in SP1 that is basically a wrapper on top of that. What it does is it checks the state of replication for all the storage groups to make sure that after the move is done, all the databases will come up. That's intelligence that's specifically in our tasks. That intelligence is not in the tasks that the cluster tools give you, namely Cluster Administrator and the cluster.exe utility. So certainly both of those tools are Exchange tasks, and the cluster tools can be used to move the clustered mailbox server. But if you move a clustered mailbox server in a CCR environment over to a storage copy that is unhealthy, the databases won't mount, and that'll result in downtime. We think that's a bad thing, which is why we recommend using our task to do the move. Now, you don't have this phenomenon in a single copy cluster because, again, it's the same storage that's moving over. So really, the benefit for using our task for a single copy cluster is really just the fact that you can add an administrative comment, and that comment gets into an event entry, and so we have some auditing and tracking going on with the move. But for CCR, use of our tasks is important because they give you that level of protection. Using the cluster tools doesn't cause bad things. The bad things have already happened. But using the cluster tools doesn't check to see if the bad things have happened. And so when you use them, they'll happily move the group over. But if the databases aren't in a mountable state, that's not the fault of using the wrong tool. That's the fact that the databases or the storage group copies weren't healthy to begin with. So that results in downtime, and that's a bad thing. Using our tools that'll do those checks, that alleviates the need for the administrator to check manually for themselves. The tools will check, and if replication is too far behind, or if the system finds that the databases won't mount, it won't do the move, and you won't have any downtime because of the move.
Does that answer your question? Because it sounded to me like you already realized about the fact of the potential of losing data if you were to use the cluster administrator. But so does this actually answer your question?
Almost. I'm just wondering, the new GUI in 2008 will do the same thing. Yeah, it may.
So the GUI in 2008 for cluster admin the fact is it's still also unaware of Exchange, right? We're aware of cluster, but cluster's not aware of us. So we are doing, as Scott mentioned, we're doing this extra logic to check to make sure that everything is healthy. So when you mount, you're not going to lose anything. That logic is not there in the 2008 cluster because it's still their same product. They're not aware of us. We're aware of them.
And to another point, it's not there because we don't want to invest putting intelligence into the cluster tools. We'd preferably like to abstract the cluster away so that an Exchange administrator doesn't have to become a cluster administrator in order to manage a clustered mailbox server. That's one of the reasons we did a lot of work in setup to gain parity, and it's one of the reasons we provide the tasks to do just about everything you need to do to move a cluster mailbox server. So ideally, when you move from Windows 2003 to Windows 2008, as long as you're using our tasks, your management paradigm doesn't change. Whereas with the cluster tools, there's a clean break. You now have a new cluster UI in Windows 2008, and if we left you to use those tools, that would be a whole nother tool that you would have to learn to use just in order to manage the same cluster mailbox server you've already been managing. So this way, there's no learning curve. You keep using our tools, the wizard and the task will do exactly the same thing, no matter what version of Windows clustering you're running.
Next question.
I'd like to know if the SCR target can coexist on a standby cluster.
Can you say that if the standby?
If the SCR role, this new role that you're referring to in the other site, can actually exist on a standby cluster. So if, for example, you had one node which was a standby cluster and you're using your active site SCC clustering, and then you're replicating across your logs, did you have a requirement to have the network name up and the IP up?
No.
So
so realize that it is not it's not a standby cluster it's not really a standby cluster. We have you can go and create a passive node that is a Windows cluster passive node for this target, for this SCR target. What you're going to be doing to activate it is you're going to be doing setup, recover CMS. So it really is kind of divorced from cluster. It's not really the relationship between the source and the target.
If for example, you weren't using CCR, you were using SCC in your...
Doesn't matter.
You would still use the same?
It's the same thing. The logic for the SCR target is the same regardless of what the source is. Okay. Regardless of whether the source is a CCR cluster, an SCC cluster, or a standalone.
Okay. So the logs are being replicated across, so you'd have to still use that. Even though the logs are there, you couldn't use standard clustering to mount the name and mount the databases on the standby cluster.
No, you would have, it's because it doesn't actually have Exchange running on there, right? It's just, it has the bits. You're going to want to have the bits on there for Exchange, but there's nothing actually running. The only thing that's really running is Windows clustering. if you wanted to make it a passive node. If you make it a standalone, you can have...
No, but what I'm saying is you would have Exchange running on there. It would be offline, the network name would be offline, the IP address would be offline.
Oh, yeah.
And then afterwards you'd be replicating to the share.
Let me see, maybe try and explain it a different way. So the requirements for the SCR target is that it has to be an Exchange 2007 Service Pack 1 system that has the mailbox server role on it. Now that can be a standalone mailbox server, or it can be the mailbox server role that is installed on a node in a cluster where the cluster does not contain any clustered mailbox servers. In other words, the cluster does not contain any active nodes. That can be a single node passive cluster. It can be a multiple node passive cluster.
Okay.
Doesn't matter, just cannot have any active clustered mailbox servers in it.
Okay, thank you.
I'll also mention one other requirement. I don't think we had it in the deck, is there's no cross operating support for standby continuous replication, which means the operating system of the source has to match the operating system of all targets as well. So that is a requirement that you'll want to keep in mind on top of that.
Okay. Another question?
Yes, if I want to set up a standby cluster on a different site, is there a possibility to make an offline movement of the database first? If you have a big database on one side to transfer it offline?
So yeah, so essentially that's called seeding. You're seeding the database. That's essentially creating your base or your starting point of that database, and then after that point you do the log shipping to bring that database continually up to date. In order to do that seeding, you can do it any way you want. So we have a task that will go and copy the database over for you. You can use any other way you want to copy the file, to copy the EDB file to that target. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Let me give you a tip. Here's how I prefer to do it. The command that Becky was talking about is update storage group copy. There's a target path parameter where you can use to override where it would normally go. Without that parameter, it's going to drop it in the same location on your target. But with that parameter, you put that database, that seeded database, anywhere you want, perhaps on a local drive. Then you can get a hold of some compression software or use something that uses WAN compression to copy that seeded to a geographically distant location, which would be the original location the task would have put it in without that parameter. So we specifically have logic in that task to redirect it somewhere else to allow you the flexibility of moving it around wherever you need to.
Thank you.
Yes, go ahead.
Just an add-on on this one. So we can copy our transaction logs on the other side and reapply them. Because of the name sequence. Is the name sequence on the target and the source the same, or it's different?
I'm having a little difficulty understanding. Were you able to understand?
Well, I have a scenario that we have a primary data center with...
Oh, primary data center, okay.
With local cluster, and it's, for example, it's in a disaster, but we have the logs that are not replicated on the target standby cluster replicate. Can we just copy from the file system to the target and replay them? And the last log renamed to E0.
Well, the one problem there is that if you were to do that is that they're not getting inspected. So when logs are copied over to the target, we first drop them into an inspection directory and inspect them to make sure that they are healthy, that they're not corrupt, that they're okay, and then we replay them. I don't know if it would actually be keeping track of anything to be able to replay those.
No.
I don't think it would do it.
Yeah, you're really actually combining two features that weren't really meant to be combined. I mean, the continuous replication handles the other feature you're trying to add into here, which is the log replay. I mean, that's the nature of Exchange. It's always had this crash recovery feature where it can replay logs into a database. If you're going to do that as a manual process, maybe because you've done a logs only restore and you need to have them replayed into the copy of a database, that's fine, but don't do that in what we call the replication pipeline. Don't do it in the replication stream. Don't use the directories that the replication service is using. Things will just get confused. It's not a scenario we test because it's not really a typical usage scenario. I mean, you can do the logs only restore, but that's a separate thing from the continuous replication technology, and you want to keep those processes and those pathways completely separate as well.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Another question?
Excuse me, can you repeat again the requirements for the standby continuous replication node or host?
Well, the requirements are, it can be a standalone. It can be, you would want to have it about the same size. It can take no more than 50 storage groups. So you can have up to, you can have it as the target for 50 storage groups maximum. It can be actually a target from multiple different servers or clustered servers. I think that is the majority.
Yeah, a couple other things worth mentioning is the source, standalone, single copy cluster, CCR. And when you use a standalone server, that can be with or without LCR. That's for the source. The target, though, if the target is a standalone mailbox server, you can't have LCR enabled on the target. We don't do remote and local on the same box, so that's one of the caveats. In fact, we'll block you from enabling LCR on any other production storage groups you have on that server. We mentioned, of course, the requirement for the operating systems to be the same. There's also the requirement, just like we have in LCR and CCR, for the storage group and database paths to be the same. So that means when we go from one-to-one copy, which is what we have in LCR and CCR, to one-to-many and many-to-one in SCR, and the fact that you can combine all these things, now you really got to keep close tabs on your storage group and database paths, not just the production ones that are in use, but also the paths used by the target copies and any recovery storage group objects that you might create as part of a database portability operation when you're activating that target. But otherwise, there's no requirement that the target be a cluster. There's no requirement that the target be on any particular subnet. There's no requirement even that the target be in the same Active Directory site. So you've got a lot of flexibility in your configuration choices.
But I can't have any active mailbox on this server, that's true?
No, that's the thing when you're using the SCR target as a clustered system. You have to put the mailbox role on there, and you do that by installing the passive clustered mailbox role. But you never install the active clustered mailbox role anywhere in the cluster. And in fact, you could use what we now call a single node cluster, but what we used to call a lone wolf cluster. That can be just a single passive node configured in a Windows failover cluster. You don't have to get fancy with the quorum. You can use the majority node set file share witness quorum, so you don't have to worry about disks or anything. And really all it's doing is just running the mailbox bits, and the replication service is just doing its thing with the replication and replay.
Thank you.
Sorry if someone has asked this before, but can a passive node of a CCR do the log shipping to a SCR?
Yes. Yes. Okay. So, well,
no.
Well, okay, actually, sorry, let me back that up. In the case where there's a failure and you're failing over to that passive node, it will pick up the replication, but in the case where it's running as the passive node, no, you're not leapfrogging. Everything is coming from the same source.
Okay.
So.
And if I have a failure in the data center where I have CCR, and a lot of people are using calendar and stuff like that, that data isn't on the hub server. So that is what you lose, if I understand. That's where you primarily lose something.
Well, so it depends on what the calendaring data is. So if it's meeting requests that you send out to other people, that's going through the transport, then it will get resubmitted. But if it's something that's just never goes to transport because it's local to you, like it's an appointment that you create for yourself, yes, it won't go through the transport and will not get. So that's a potential for getting lost. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Just a short question about the licenses. If we want to use standby the SCR functionalities, do we require Enterprise Edition or can we use it with standard editions?
I think we finalized on standard edition.
So we have to wait on the...
It was the last I had been told, which was fairly recently, was that it was going to be available on standard. So the way it works is if your target is a standalone, then it's standard edition, and if your target is going to be a Windows cluster passive, then it's going to be enterprise. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And if we have two sites, site 1, site 2, with mail 1, mail 2, can we use both servers as source and target with different storage groups and on different drives? Let's say I have a bunch of users on site 1, a bunch of users on site 2. Each one is using a standalone server at their main Exchange server, and we replicate data that are located on mail 1 to mail 2 and data from mail 1 to mail 2.
Yes, you can. So that's what I was talking about at the beginning of the presentation, where they, as long as they're both standalones, you can actually be replicating across.
We can cross.
So you can split, but realize also that it can be no more than 50 storage groups on either server.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So, yeah, and you also want to make sure that if there is a failure of one of those servers, that when the other server takes over for everybody, that it is able to perform well enough for all of those storage groups.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you.